Hello, everyone. I feel like this is kind of strange. I feel like I'm talking to myself a little bit because I guess I am. But welcome to Lesson 6. I want to start off by actually doing something a little bit different, where I'm actually going to talk about the history of the English language just in brief. This is important to the study of words because it kind of helps us to know where to start from, because the English language really does pull from so many different other languages that knowing kind of what origin the words are can actually help us. That's why when there are spelling bees, a lot of times you'll hear kids ask, can I have the origin of the word, because that would help them to be able to spell it and help them be able to know kind of what country and language to associate the word with. So let's start by reading a little bit of this. It's kind of a silly infographic, but a lot of the information is really good. So we're going to start actually out of India, which goes back quite a ways, 6,000 to 3,000 BC, which is, of course, about 5,000 years ago from where we are. So the beginnings of European languages developed in India, and they traveled north. So these Indo-European languages became distinct as people divided across Europe and culminated in the Celtic in ancient Britain. So ancient Britain is really where the language began. But if you were to hear this language, you would not recognize it. If any of you are familiar with the book Beowulf, Beowulf was written in this type of English, but it would be unrecognizable to the English that we use today. So we're back here in pre-55 BC. So the native language of Britain was Celtic. This came from the Woads of the time, who were a very barbaric, wild people. Then what happened was Rome came along, as they did very often during this time period, and they conquered a lot of Britain. But there's little Latin impact on the Celtic language. Many Latin words didn't catch on with the agrarian native British, so they didn't really want to adopt a lot of Latin because they weren't a fan of the British people coming into their land and trying to take it over, so they weren't going to adopt their language either. But there are some words that we still get from this old Celtic. For example, candle was candle, the wine, or wine as we call it, and the wheel we call wall today. So it was a very kind of nasally harsh language if you ever hear it spoken. Now, from Latin, around 200 words entered the language at this time. Here are some of them, which you might recognize a few of them from what we've learned so far. So now we're getting into AD time period. So we're after the Romans have been living in Britain for a while, and the language is beginning to develop. So if you look over here, the origin of Old English is starting to sound a little bit more like what we say. It would be a little bit hard to understand, but it's pretty close. So 1/3 of the modern English language uses everyday Anglo-Saxon words like earth, night, house, food, bake, sleep, loaf, and all, etc. All these words come from that Old English. Now there are also a whole lot of other words that we don't use anymore that are part of the Old English. So the Anglos, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians introduced West Germanic, which would become distinct from the continent. And it's a very German sound, so there's a lot of throaty type of vowels. So we get the Tuesday, Woden's Day, Thor's Day, and Freya's Day. You might recognize some of these if you're a fan of the Avengers. Thor, for example, is a famous Norse god, and that's where we get the word Thursday. And Freya, who is his mother, is where we get the word Friday. So Christian missionaries, as a lot of times happens, because of religion, the missionaries bring languages into other parts. So they bring Latin as a language of the new religion. So now we're going to start to get a whole lot more Latin influence than we did during the last time that the Romans invaded. Because, of course, they're not coming as invaders. They are coming as religious representatives. So we get words like martyr, mass, altar, bishop, school, tower, front, which are all very religious-oriented words. Then comes the 7th century, which would be the 600s, and the Latin speakers name our country Anglia, the land of the Angles. Now, that's not talking about an angle like a right angle or a obtuse angle or acute angle. It would be mostly talking about angels. Angels. So this is where we eventually will get the word England, as you can imagine. So we're moving along here. The Viking invaded soon saw the Norse as the dominant power of East England. Their influence waned or got less as they repulsed to the northeast of England by King Alfred the Great. And then we get these words from the Norse. So the burgeoning or the growing English settlement began to cement national identity. And there were 2,000 new words introduced. So already you can tell the English language is beginning to become quite the hodgepodge of different languages. So King William of Normandy conquers England. French becomes the language of the law, aristocracy, and power. So now we have French becoming a part of the English language, and actually French has quite a bit of Latin influence as well. So we're about to get even more Latin influence up until this point. And we get words like parliament, slander, larceny, bacon, evidence. In fact, actually, the reason why we don't say we're eating pig when we eat bacon is because the French thought it was kind of a little bit rude to call it eating pig or eating the meat. So in order to distance themselves from the dirtiness of eating a pig, they had this fancy word for bacon, and the bacon is what we now call bacon, and it sounds a lot better. Same thing with cow. We don't say we eat cow, we say we eat beef. And that comes from the French too, and the same with mutton, although I don't think most of us eat mutton on a very regular basis at all. Let's see. Okay, so then we move on to the 100 Years' War, and tension between the English and the French created a war that, as you can imagine, lasted for at least 100 years, in this case actually 116 years, and then French became the language of the enemy and was no longer de rigueur, which basically means it was no longer in fashion to speak French, so we tried to distance ourselves from it, the British did, but at the same time it definitely still lingered in a lot of words that we still use today. Then came Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is actually one of the biggest influences on the English language. He really made it popular, and he made it cool, I guess, to speak English in the world. So he invented over 2,000 words and phrases that we still use today. So some words that you actually are probably very familiar with and didn't think Shakespeare invented, like eyeball, eat someone out of house and home, green-eyed monster, which is someone who's jealous, your flesh and blood, breaking the ice. He even invented the word anchovy. So lots and lots of words that he invented that we probably don't even think of. Okay, then continuing on, the King James Bible came along, and this is the Bible that many Christians still use today, and a lot of words were invented or created in order to fulfill that book as well. So literature really did have a huge influence on the English language. Then came the British Empire. So finally, people are not controlling Britain anymore. They are controlling themselves, if you will. So English grew by absorbing words from global travels and empire building. This was the time period when the British Empire was expanding. So people from Britain were traveling all over the world, and we got a lot of words from them. For example, from the Caribbean, we got barbecue and cannibal. From India, cummerbund and bungalow. Africa, voodoo and zombie. Australia, nugget and boomerang. There were also other ones too, the Native Americans, the raccoon and squash, cookies, coleslaw, from Germany, pretzels and delicatessen, and Italian, of course, we get a lot of food from there, as well as the mafia. So lots of different fun facts here that you can kind of read as I'm scrolling down a little bit here. And eventually the dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary in 1884, became kind of the foremost source for the English language, and it continues up until this day. So then we come to the present time. 1972 is when they say this started, but of course it's grown since then. Emails to texting to the internet, and new words were created. For example, download never existed before that. FYI, toolbar, by the way, etc. So the English language actually has words taken or at least derived from over 350 English languages rather. And so that's actually pretty crazy that our language comes from 350 other languages. So English really did not become a language of its own devices. It was mostly just influenced by a lot of other languages, which is why it's kind of fun to learn, because we can learn all about the origins of different words. Incidentally, did you know that the typical American words, diaper, candy, fall, faucet, were actually English words taken to American shores? So these are all words that we use in America. These are the words that they use in Britain. All right, so interesting stuff here, but let's go ahead and move on to our main lesson today. Okay. All right, so lesson 6. Today's going to be kind of a longer lesson, and then lesson 7 is actually going to be fairly short because, again, lesson 7 is going to be going to include a review test over lessons 1 through 6. So it's going to include all the words that we've learned up to lesson 6, and then it's going to move on from there. So let's go ahead and begin here. Okay, so we'll start here. So this is actually from Shakespeare, the Shakespearean play Hamlet, which you're probably familiar with if you are familiar at all with Shakespeare. It's one of his most famous speeches, and it's often been parodied and kind of made fun of. But I want to see if you can figure out what it means, essentially, based only on figuring out what the subject and verb of each sentence is. Now, you might be asking, why are we learning about grammar, subjects, and verbs in a vocabulary class? Because it is essential to know the grammar of a sentence in order to understand the context of the words that you're trying to learn, and also just understand the passage itself. For example, Shakespeare is not an easy author to read. He writes not in Old English, it's actually modern English, but it is difficult for us to understand because he writes in complex sentence structures. So figuring out the subject and verb actually is going to help us quite a bit. So I want to do a few with you here, and then I might have you do some on your own. So you can kind of mentally just answer questions as you go here, and then I will out loud just give you the answer, sort of. So for number 1 here, to be or not to be, that is the question. So we start with an infinitive phrase followed by another infinitive phrase, and then we have that is the question. So the subject of this sentence actually is that. But that is a pronoun which refers to what comes before it. So to be or not to be, it is essentially the subject and verb. To be or not to be is, and then the question in this case, whoops, let me make this a little bit smaller so that it's easy to see. So to be or not to be is, and then question would be the object here. So that's the first sentence structure. So that helps out a little bit. So now we get into a slightly more complex structure. Whether 'tis, and 'tis is a contraction for it is. So whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Okay, now we're into the slightly more complicated ones. So let's try to figure out what the subject and verb here too. So our subject actually comes from our contraction there, and it is it. So basically it's asking a question. Is it, and this is the question that it refers to up here, the question of to be or not to be. Now, so he's rewording it. So the to be part of it is essentially, is it nobler or more noble? And then he has two options. To suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or the second one, the not to be, to take arms against trouble and by opposing, so by fighting against them, end them and end them. So essentially what he's asking here when he asks to be or not to be is he's saying, is it better to keep suffering in this life or to basically take arms up against trouble and to try to stop it from happening? So how can he end this trouble? What is he proposing that he do? Unfortunately, because this is Hamlet and he is a very troubled person in general, his option is to die, essentially. So this would be the second option. So rather than just suffering through life, he's saying, oh, how wonderful it would be just to, in one swift motion, die, essentially, to sleep. Now, he's saying here, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. So the verb here is understood. So to die is to be, going back to the be here, to be no more. And then it has another sentence. Whenever you see a semicolon, it means it's introducing a new sentence. And then he says, by a sleep to say we end the heartache. So by a sleep to end the heartache of life. And then it says the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. And basically the suffering of the body. So he is saying to die is to be no more, and to sleep, and of course sleep is not what we think of when we think of sleeping, but it is referring to death in this case. But to sleep is to end the heartache and the suffering of the body. So he's saying if I just can sleep, if I just can let my body go into its natural state, then everything will be better again. That's what he is contemplating in this moment. So he is contemplating suicide, which is, again, if you know what Hamlet went through up to this point, his father was murdered, his uncle was the one who did it, his mother is betraying him, the love of his life, could be killed at any moment. I mean, he is going through a lot of heartache and pain. And so this is why he's contemplating the question to be, in other words, to exist or not to exist. That's the question he's going for. Then he says, "'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished." Now, let's try to figure out what consummation means in this context. So you may know what consummation means. We have con, which means with, of course, so that at least gives you a place to start out with. So let's try to figure out what the subject and verb is in this sentence. So we have another tis, and if you remember what tis means, it essentially means it is. So it is a consummation devoutly to be wished. So he's wishing for this thing devoutly. So if you can kind of guess what it might mean, it comes from the Latin word with again, and then sum, which means is where we get the word consume essentially. So when you consume something, it is essentially finished. So it is basically an end to be wished for. So that's what he's saying essentially. And then he kind of continues this same structure. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. There's the rub. Okay, now the rub here that he's talking about is not what we think of when we think of like rubbing your skin or something like that. The rub means there's the problem essentially. So he's saying death leads to essentially sleep. And then he's saying sleep leads to dreaming. And they said there is the rub, or there is the problem. Now, what is the problem he's talking about here? Let's talk about it a little bit. So he's saying, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. So what is he worried about? It says here, in that sleep of death, so when he dies, what dreams may come when, and then here's the break. So, or the subject and verb. So we have shuffled off this mortal coil, which essentially means, if you're going to reword this, when we have died, what dreams will we have? So what dreams will give us pause? In other words, what will we think about when we're dead, essentially? There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. So he's saying, here is what makes trouble of so long a life. So he's saying this is where trouble or calamity of life comes, because we're worried about what comes after death. He's saying he's not sure. And then he says, for who would bear, now bear in this case, I'm sure you can guess, means tolerate. Who would tolerate the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrongs, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? So let's go through all these things that he's talking about here. So he's asking a question. Hamlet loves to ask questions. And here's the question he's asking. He's saying essentially here, who would bear, and then he has a whole bunch of things he says he would bear. Whips and scorns of times, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely. Well, let's talk about what contumely means. You know that it has something to do with pride. So contumely essentially means like kind of an insulting display of contempt in words or actions, just basically insulting someone in a humiliating way. So contumely, I'll write that down for you guys to remember, hopefully. One of the things is contumely, which is basically insult. Okay, so he's saying, who would bear contumely the pangs of a despised love? So basically a love that is forbidden. He feels it in his heart like a pang, like someone stabbing him almost. The law's delay, in other words, the law's not even on his side. The insolence of office. If you're not familiar with insolence, it's definitely a word that you should know. So insolent essentially means being defiant or going against the rules. And then he says, lastly, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. So essentially, he's saying the unworthy, or the people who don't deserve it, are the ones who win, basically. Now let's go down to that bodkin at the end. So bodkin is probably maybe not a word that you're familiar with. It's not actually a word that I'm super familiar with, too. It's not like I say it every day. But a bodkin in this case, let's try to figure out what it means. So he's saying, why would we bear all of these things if we could just make our quiet with and in this case, bodkin? Now, let's try to figure out what he means by this. Now, what would help him to have quietness at last? And again, it's going back to that, terrible idea of ending his own life. So a bodkin actually is essentially like a sword, basically. A sword. So something with which to take his own life. And if you are familiar with Shakespeare, there's a lot of people who end their own lives in these types of manners, like in Romeo and Juliet, etc. Let me move all these up. I didn't space these out very well. Okay. And then we have number 9. We'll just go ahead and finish this. So who would these fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather to bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of? So I want you kind of out loud or in your own head to ask yourself, okay, what does this mean? What is this saying? Because I think you'll be able to get it. Based off of everything that we've talked about thus far, I think you should be able to understand this, but we'll talk about it anyway. So it says, who would bear these fardels? Now, if you can probably guess what fardels means, it's essentially everything he was talking about before. So if we were going to define it, fardels basically means like burdens, basically. So who would bear the burdens? And essentially that's everything that he said in the last paragraph. or the last sentence rather. So who would bear the burdens of grunting and sweating under a weary life, except under what circumstances? Under what circumstances would we bear burdens? Who would bear the burdens unless they had, and then it says, the dread of something after death, of the unknown after death, essentially. So he's saying the only reason why people are not necessarily just ending their lives all over the place is because we don't know what comes after it. Now, I know this is a very depressing piece of literature, but it's a beautifully written piece as well, and that's why we're spending so much time on it. So the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. So in other words, no one has ever come back from this place after death, so we don't know what's after it. And he says it puzzles the will, so it confuses us, and it makes us rather to bear the ills we have than to fly to others that we don't know about. Then he says, thus conscience does make cowards of it all. So what does he mean by conscience here? He's saying conscience makes cowards of us all. Now, you're probably familiar with conscience when it comes to, like, you feel something prick your conscience. This is pretty much the same thing. In this case, it's a little bit different. In this case, it's talking about, like, awarenesses. So the inner sense of, like, what's right and wrong. So that sense makes us cowards. And thus, the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought. So resolution in this case means decision. So all these decisions that we would make that are natural to us are sicklied over, so is basically covered over with the pale cast of thought. So because we think so much about it, we decide not to act. And then it says, in enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. So in the end, he decides not to kill himself. Not because he's a coward necessarily, but because he says that it really is because he feels like he is a coward and cannot go through with it. Now, of course, we know that this is the right action to take, that going and taking one's own life is actually the cowardly act. The cowardly act is not, as Hamlet says, to sort of decide not to act at all and just keep on living. So he is actually saying that he's being a coward here, but in fact he's actually being quite brave. So just one quick look at all this. If you wanted to write this down, you can do this, and then we'll move on to the next page. All right, so we have a few just fun cartoons. We're not going to go over them in class, really, but I just want to mention that these exist to kind of help you remember words. For example, the first word is chattel, an item of personal, movable property or a slave. So Texas cattle were his chattel. So this, he's branding it, and it says, this here is Texas Smith's chattel here. So the bank held a chattel mortgage on all our office equipment, chairs, computers, and even our electric clock. So it was basically their property to take as they wanted to. Please do not order me around, Lady Boswell. I am neither your servant nor your chattel. And the chattel belonging to Herodotus of Athens at his death were 16 slaves, 7 horses, 6 hunting dogs, and 3 midget gladiators. Okay, then we have austere, which means stern, as in manner, without excessive, unadorned, severely simple and plain. So an austere steer is no fun at a party. So this poor steer here is just too serious, too stern. And the noun form is austerity, and then the adverb austerely. Lament means to express sorrow or regret, to mourn someone. And here it says, we lament that Joe got buried in cement. Which is kind of a dark thing to say, but that's what it is. So lament is a verb, but it can be used as an adjective. It is lamentable, etc. Okay. Aloof means distant, reserved in manner, uninvolved. So think of roof aloof. So Snowball the cat was so aloof when guests came that she hid on the roof. So someone who's aloof thinks that they're either better than other people, or perhaps they just think that they could be shy or something like that. Okay, let's go ahead and go over a few of these. We're going to spend not too much time because I'll probably have you do most of this for homework, but I do want to briefly go over these. So cur means to run. So if you find it difficult to hang on to your money, don't be surprised. The word currency means literally running. The currency in circulation in a country is constantly running from person to person. And if currency should run through the hands of a person or company too rapidly, it might be the precursor or forerunner of bankruptcy. So let's go through these words. First, we have concourse, which is a large open space where crowds gather. So it literally comes from to run together, which, as you can imagine, has to do with being everyone at the same place, essentially. So the main concourse in the airport was filled with tourists. Concur means to agree with other people, basically. So it means, again, to run together, but in this case, it's slightly different because concur just means to agree, to run with other people so you're all on the same page, basically. Concurrent means running together at the same time. So occurring at the same time is what concurrent means. So the town council and the school board held concurrent meetings. The courier is one who carries or runs with messages. So the courier arrived with the letter. So we don't use this word too often anymore, courier, but we do use it every once in a while. So courier just means someone who runs ahead and gives a message usually. Current, as you probably are aware, is just the flow of water, air, electricity, or just something that's prevalent at the moment as current fashions. So the current trend is towards smaller cars. Curriculum is a race course. Today we use it basically just to talk about courses offered by educational institution. So the curriculum offers me a wide choice of courses. So the curriculum for this class, for example, I choose myself, but a lot of times in your schools, your teachers have a curriculum that they have to use. They don't have a choice. And then cursive, I kind of previewed this last week, but cursive basically just means handwriting where the letters are joined together. So she preferred to print rather than write in cursive. And then cursory is also a word that we've had before. It means running over rapidly without attention to detail. Hasty and superficial, like perfunctory. So she gave the novel only a cursory reading. It would be the opposite of thorough. Then we have discourse, which means to speak at length about something, a formal and lengthy discussion of a subject. He gave a discourse on Ibsen's symbolism. So discourse means to run apart. So run apart in that it kind of is not necessarily off topic, but it's just to pick a topic and then run with it, basically. Excursion is to run out. Literally, right now it means a short journey. So if you go on an excursion, it's just a little journey somewhere. So we took a day's excursion down the river. Precursor is a person or thing that runs before, a forerunner. So we've talked about this word before as well. So we talked about antecedent. This essentially means the same thing. So, the telephone is a precursor to the modern cell phone. Recourse, to run back, literally means, a turning to or seeking help, safety, or aid. So violence should never be one's first recourse. So recourse of action is just the first thing you think of when in an emergency. And then to recur or recurrent just means happening again, basically. So Lisa's recurrent infections worried her doctor. We have concurrence, corridor, course, currency, incur, incursion, occur, and occurrence. So a lot of them there. All right, let's go ahead and do a few of these, and I'll basically answer them, but I'm going to go ahead and pause before I put the answer so that you guys can hopefully get a chance to, in your own homes, say the correct answer here and hopefully get it right. Okay, so first of all, we have the courses offered by an educational institution, and that is correct. C, curriculum. Hopefully you got that. Handwriting with letters that join together. Very good. That would be E, cursive. A forerunner of something. Now this is a tough one, but think for, F-O-R-E, means before. So you're absolutely correct. It is A, precursor. To speak at length about something, as I do each week with vocabulary, would be F, a discourse. One who carries messages, such as a messenger, or, as you can maybe see there, would be B, a courier. Very good. And then lastly, to happen again, literally to run back, would be correct. D, recur. Very good. So I'm sure you got all of those right, hopefully, and I believe in you guys. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So because the two parties were blank, Stan had to choose which one to attend. So they were both happening at the same time. They were concurrent. Very good. Whoever said that. Excellent job. Okay, now we have her day-long blank to the mountains made her feel as if she had vacation for the week. So this is the word for a trip, or in this case, an excursion. Very good, everyone who said that. All right, excellent job. Really quickly, number 3, French school children learn to write in blank when they are in kindergarten, unlike American children who sometimes actually don't learn this at all. So if you do not know how to write in cursive, you definitely should learn to. It's actually been a proven fact that students who write in cursive actually tend to be smarter kids. Not necessarily because of any magic of the cursive, but what it does is it helps ideas to be put in a manner in which you remember them, because cursive takes a tiny bit more thought than printing, and therefore when you write in cursive you tend to remember what you wrote down better. It's actually science. So the swift blank carried our raft down the river is current, as I'm sure you already guessed. Most colleges include a core blank of English, math, and science. So everyone studies the same thing. It is considered curriculum. Curriculum, correct. Okay. If you don't understand an assignment, your best blank is to ask your teacher. So your best course of action, or another way of putting that, is your best recourse. Remember they talked about recourse is what decision you make in a split second. So when you don't have much time to make a decision, what is the decision to make? So his blank asthma attacks convinced him to see a specialist. So his, and in this case we're looking for something that happens quite a bit, I guess. So his recurrent, so the things that happen quite a bit. I blank with your suggestions and will recommend them to the group. So I agree. Another way of saying I agree is I concur. And then number 9, I was surprised at his blank reading of the important legal document. So he should have read it carefully, but instead he only gave it a cursory reading. And then last one, hundreds of waiting passengers filled up the airport's that strip of space. The large opening where crowds are is a concourse. Now, most of the time, concourse is just in reference to an airport. It's very rare that you hear the word concourse and is not referring to an airport in some capacity. All right, very good. Let's move on to the next one. So this one, we won't do any of the exercises. We'll just go over the word or the roots. And this root is dem, which means people. So many words have changed their meanings over the centuries. So demagogue is an example, and it actually means the opposite of what it originally meant. So it was first used at the time of the Peloponnesian War. The word demagogue, which literally means people leader, referred to a leader or orator who championed the cause of common people, of Athens in their fight against the aristocrats of Sparta. Gradually through the years, however, such leaders began pursuing their own interest rather than helping the people, and today a demagogue is actually a political leader who makes impassioned appeals to the emotions and prejudices of people to gain personal power. So it's not someone who speaks for the common people and who is just a great leader. It's someone who manipulates people in order to gain personal power. So that's what demagogue means. Demagoguery is just the noun form of that. Actually, they're both nouns, but this is essentially the methods and practices of being a demagogue. So her campaign speech was pure demagoguery. Democracy is probably a word that you're familiar with. It literally means rule or people rule or rule by the people. So it's government by representatives elected by the people, which is sort of what we have. We have a little bit more of a republic than a democracy, but we definitely have democratic elements. Demographic is essentially just pertaining to the study of human populations, especially their density. distribution and vital statistics. So the 2010 census gathered a wealth of demographic information. Like a demographic information would tell what race a city is primarily, what religion people practice, how many kids, how much does each household make financially. They'll tell a lot of things. And then endemic, we probably wouldn't have even noticed the dem in here if not for this. So it literally means in people, and it basically means native to a particular people or country, as in an endemic disease or an endemic animal, which occurs only among certain people, or an endemic plant or animal, which is found only in a certain location. So the snail darter, which is an endangered species, is endemic to the local Tennessee River. So think like native, basically. Epidemic is, again, another word that we didn't even notice the dem in, and it's a disease or other abnormal condition spreading rapidly among many people. So the flu epidemic caused many absences from work. And then pandemic is among all people or widespread. So the economic depression was pandemic. All right, very good. Now for this one, they have some practice here, which I'll have you do on your own. Then down below, there's some review. Now this will be good review for your test that you're going to be taking, because most of these words, or most of these roots rather, are going to be on it. So you want to review what each of these means and try to remember words that include them. So most of these you should know, but if you are not quite sure, go ahead and review these again on your own. All right, the third one here we have is dict, which means to speak, to speak. So this is probably a one that you're familiar with, I would guess. So the word addict has a long history. In Roman law, to addict a person meant to turn that person over to a master by sentencing or speaking of the court. Through the years, addict has kept something of its old meaning, and that it now refers to turning oneself over to a habit, which can, of course, be a master. So when you're addicted to something, it actually literally means that something else is a master over you. So people who are addicted to drugs, they have this feeling that they are not their own masters. They are being controlled by the drugs. Same thing with people who are addicted to coffee. I'm not naming names, but I am a little bit addicted to coffee. And coffee, I sometimes feel like, is my master. It tells me that I don't want to wake up in the morning, and it tells me that I need more of it. So that's kind of just a fun word origin. All right, abdicate. Abdicate literally means to speak away, so to renounce formally, so to give up basically a throne or high office. So the king abdicated his throne. The CEO abdicated his position in the company, whatever that might be. Contradict, contra means against, plus dict, which means to speak. So to speak against or to assert the opposite of what someone has said. I didn't dare to contradict her. Dictate just means to speak or read something out loud, to be recorded by another, or to give orders or commands. So the boss dictates his letter slowly. Dictator, as you probably know, is just a person whose speech is to be taken as the final word, one who orders others around, or a tyrannical ruler. So the small country was ruled by a dictator, and dictatorial is just an adjective form. Diction is just choice of words in speaking or writing. So she used excellent diction, always choosing exactly the right word. It could also just be enunciation in speaking or singing. His diction was so clear that he could be understood at the back of the auditorium. So people who do a lot of public speaking probably have good diction. They are eloquent speakers and they have good diction because they pronounce things very exactly. Then there's an edict. An edict is an official decree. So the Edict of Nantes granted toleration to the Protestants in France. Jurisdiction just means the ability to speak in law. So someone who has jurisdiction has the right to interpret and apply the law, legal power to hear and decide cases, the extent of such judicial or other authority. So the case is not within the court's jurisdiction. Then there's predict, which means to speak beforehand, to foretell. So to know beforehand, like prognosticate basically. So the Bureau of Meteorology predicts a late spring. And then the valedictorian, vala means farewell. So it's a person who speaks, usually of the highest scholastic standing, at the farewell speech at commencement of graduation. So I'm sure all three of you will be the valedictorians of your classes, and you'll be standing up there after you graduate high school giving the speech to the rest of your class. So the valedictorian gave an inspiring speech at graduation. So again, addict, addiction, benediction, which if you remember is a blessing. Yes, exactly. Dictionary, you know what that means. A dictum is kind of like an edict a little bit. Interdict is to speak between. And then malediction is a curse. And then the verdict, vert or verse, means truth. So a verdict is to say the truth. So when someone is declared guilty or innocent in a verdict, they are hopefully saying the truth about what actually happened. All right, let's do just a little bit here. We probably will just get to the first section. So number 1 there, when Edward VII blanked his throne to marry the divorced Mrs. Simpson, the world was shocked. So he gave up his throne, or he literally abdicated it. Okay, the manager will blank letters to his secretary later this afternoon. So he will speak out loud, or he will, in this case, we're looking for dictate. Okay, then we have the large number of cases in her blank overwhelmed the judge. So the cases in her, in this case, we're looking for jurisdiction. Remember, jurisdiction is basically where you have the ability to practice a law, or what cases you have. Because she had the highest grade point average, she is the valedictorian of her class. The foreign student took classes to improve his, and in this case we're looking for his ability to speak well, or his diction. The teacher's blank attitude never allows her students to voice their opinions. So she is dictatorial. So dictatorial means basically she talks over everyone, and it says that her word is law, and there's no room for any other voices. Based on her improved study habits, Sharmila blank a successful semester. So she predicts, she expects it to happen. The king's blank granted all citizens the right to own property. So his declaration, or in this case his edict, allowed them to have the right to own property. Cuba is the longest reigning blank in modern history. So as you can imagine, there haven't been too many governments that have been successfully this way. But in this case, it would be dictatorship in history. And if you're not sure who that is, look that up. That's Fidel Castro, who is the person they're talking about there. The evidence will either affirm or blank her story. So in this case, we're looking for it will either confirm it, or it will contradict it. It will go against. Good. Okay. And then below here, we're giving the root and 2 words for each of the meaning. So people, remember the root was dem, so we can have demagogue or democratic. Around or both could be circum in this case. So circumstantial, circumnavigate, etc. So you can go ahead and do these on your own, the review. All right, now we have some other review here. So we're not going to go over this in too much detail. These are, excuse me, these are all to do with the prefix dis. So dis, when you attach it to a word or root that starts with an S, you're going to end up with a double S. So add dis to the following. So it'd be dissatisfied with 2 S's. Dissimilar, disservice, dissect, dissent, dissident, and dissolve. There's one exception, which is dispirited. And I like what they say here, that no one in their right mind would ever pretend that English actually makes sense. It is actually thoroughly logical and consistent, very rarely, and it always has some pitfalls for the unwary or for the person not paying too much attention. Then they have some spelling exercises, and actually I forgot to blot out the answers, so you guys can skip this since the answers are already written there for you. So then we have the Latin cum. So con, as in consent, is actually the prefix com, which, like add, changes its spelling dependent on the first letter of the roots attached to. It's com before b, combine. M before M, of course, commingle. And P, it's com as well, so companion. It's col before another L, so collect. It's cor before another R, correlate. Co before a vowel, coitus. And H before, and before H, cohere, or W, co-worker. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move quickly through this. Okay. So here we have sentio, which we've been talking about before, census, and they all have to do with feeling, if you remember from earlier. So all of them have to do with feeling or perceiving. So a sensation, for example, is, of course, a feeling, as I'm sure you knew. And then little children, we have agreed, are sensuous. They react keenly to pleasurable feelings. So especially babies, they like to feel things. If you ever have a baby who has something that crinkles or makes kind of a neat sound, they really like those. And when a baby's tickled, they laugh. That's a very sensual feeling. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. You'll notice there's actually several blanks here. That's because there were some not necessarily inappropriate questions, but just something that I thought it would be better to skip. So there are a few that are blocked out, but the rest of them are in there. I want to call attention especially to this last page here, or the last two pages rather, in which case there is review of pretty much everything we talked about. So I do want you to go through these 20 at least, because probably you will be seeing all 20 of these on the test for lesson 7, which you will be taking either next week if you choose to, or perhaps you're taking it right after you finish this lesson. So whatever you want to do is completely up to you. I will leave that to your discretion. One thing I would encourage you to do is not leave the test until, the 2 weeks from now when I come back and the class is almost started. It will just not make you perform at your best. And as I said before, I can't stop you from going ahead and looking at your notes, and I wouldn't try to do that. But at the same time, I will tell you that if you do use your notes, you just won't have as strong of a learning experience as if you went ahead and tried to answer the questions without using your notes. So that would be my recommendation. Either way, I'll go ahead and stop the lesson for today, and I'll probably be recording lesson 7 right after this, so I'll see you in a little bit.